Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. In this podcast, I want to present a critique of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Now, I'm not saying that I totally dismiss it. I don't. I think that there are some aspects of the Frankfurt School that are good and useful. But overall, I see a number of problems with it, and I will try to bring out those problems in this video. Basically, the Frankfurt School originated in Germany, in Frankfurt, Germany. When World War II broke out and Hitler came to power, there was a fear among people in the Frankfurt School, many of whom were Jewish, that they would be targeted by Hitler, and most likely they would be. So the Frankfurt School basically relocated to the United States, primarily to New York City, but also to Waltham, Massachusetts, in the case of Herbert Marcuse. So that transition from Frankfurt to the US basically kind of unified the Frankfurt School, I would say, in a way that it had not been unified before. It made the people in the Frankfurt School very, very respectable, which they were. They had a very strong effect, for example, on the formation of the new School for Social Research, although they were not actually a part of it, but still, their influence on it was very significant. Here's my problem with it, my major problem with the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School is basically a hybrid, at least in most cases, of Marxism, or the kind of Marxism that existed in the Frankfurt School, which I'll get to in a moment, and Marxism. Now, the type of Marxism that existed in the Frankfurt School was variable because each person in the Frankfurt School had a different point of view. Some of them were more radical than others. Some of them were less radical. Some of them were more committed to revolution than others. Others were less committed to revolution. So there was considerable diversity in the Frankfurt School. So it would be a mistake to put the entire Frankfurt School into a single category. It certainly is not that. The Frankfurt School was a diverse school of thought, which started in Frankfurt, Germany, and then made its way to the US. At the end of World War II, most, but not all, members of the Frankfurt School in the US migrated back to Germany. The major exception to that was Herbert Marcuse, who remained in Waltham, Massachusetts. So he was the major exception, but aside from him, almost everyone else moved back to Germany. That's understandable. You want to go back to your home, and there really was no reason for them not to after World War II, and so the majority of them did. But what the Frankfurt School did that I see as extremely problematic is they attempted to combine various versions of what is commonly called Western Marxism with Freudianism. Now, what is Western Marxism? That is a complex topic. there are many different forms of Western Marxism, but to a considerable degree, and I want to qualify this because I'm trying to be careful not to put all of my eggs in one basket. The people in the Frankfurt School were all different, but to a considerable degree, the Marxists in the Frankfurt School were idealists. So, just as Marx said that he had turned Hegel upside down on his head, basically replacing German idealism with his own form of materialism, influenced largely by Ludwig Feuerbach. What the Frankfurt School did, much like the rest of Western Marxism, is to once again turn Marxism on its head, except this time it was to turn Marxism upside down on its head back to Hegel. Why they did that? Well, there are various reasons. If you rely primarily on early Marx, and you can debate what that means, it has been very hotly debated for a long time, but what many people have said is that Marx himself, who was one of the young Hegelians prior to starting Marxism with his friend Friedrich Engels, the early Marx was more idealistic, ontologically idealistic. In other words, his approach was much more aligned with Hegel than it was with Feuerbach. I think that is a fair thing to say. That's basically the type of Marxism which was embraced by most, but not all, members of the Frankfurt School. Now, the majority of people in the West have never heard of the Frankfurt School. I would suggest that the majority of people in the West have never even heard of critical social theory. But most Americans, I think, this is my guess, have heard of Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm was a member of the Frankfurt School, but he was one of the less radical members of that school. He is best known for his study of love. So a lot of people read Fromm not even knowing that he was a Marxist, not aware of his background at all. Just seeing Fromm isolated from the rest of the Frankfurt School as an entity unto himself. Is that bad? Yes and no. Again, yes, because it does not explain where Fromm came from, and it's important to always contextualize thinkers in their own historical origins. But no, in the sense that that basically by not placing Fromm into the context of the Frankfurt School, it allowed him to speak for himself. It allowed him to be an individual. And Fromm was very much of an individual. Now, you can make the argument about many people in the Frankfurt School, whether Horkheimer or Puza or Fromm, whoever, that they were exceptions to the Frankfurt School, that they had deviated from the actual ideas that were common in the Frankfurt School. But Fromm is the best example of that. Fromm was the biggest deviant. And I don't mean deviant necessarily in the usual sociological way, in which deviance refers to behavior which is an extreme violation of social norms. I just mean that he deviated from the way in which most other thinkers in the Frankfurt School developed their ideas. Perhaps the oddest person in the Frankfurt School um, was, well, I'll mention his school of thought first, and then come back to him. His school of thought is called orgonomy. Anyone know who I mean? Well, orgonomy was a particular approach to Marxism. I mean, orgonomy was opposed to fascism. One of the classical books in orgonomy was against fascism, and it was a very well written book opposing fascism. But that's not what really orgonomy is. That's not the essence of what constituted orgonomy. Orgonomy was really the beginning of what is commonly called body work. Body work, which includes things like Rolfing and Alexander technique and various other things like that, was inspired to a considerable degree by the work of Wilhelm Reich, the founder of orgonomy. Now, Reich did not inspire the Alexander technique, but you can see parallels between orgonomy and the Alexander technique. The idea that Reich developed in his orgonomy is that orgone was the substance or the force of the universe. If that sounds weird, it is weird. Really what Reich did is he took Freud's concept of the libido and he expanded upon it. Of course, the libido, according to Freud, was the basic sexual nature of human beings. To Freud, there were two basic instincts, as he called them, which human beings have. One is the libido, which is the sexual instinct, and the other is violence. So when Freud would interpret dreams, he would commonly interpret dreams as some kind of hybrid of sex, the libido, and violence. Very, very controversial. Now, Freud himself was a very controversial figure. And I think that the best way really to understand Freud is to read Freud's writings. Freud's writings tell us a lot more about Freud than they do about Freudianism, or as it is generally called, psychoanalysis. You can really learn a lot about Freud and his own problems, his own complexes, by reading his writings. Freud was very territorial. That is a pretty calm way of putting it. He had a very strong commitment to psychoanalysis, which he originated. He was also arguably the originator of what later became known as talk therapy, which of course includes a lot of schools of thought which are not necessarily Freudian. But what Freud would do is he would have patients come into his office like 5 days a week. They would lay down on a couch and you would simply have them talk. Freud and other psychoanalysts would not say a word. Well, that's not exactly right. They would say, uh-huh, yes, things like that. But basically, they would not say a word. For that reason, psychoanalysis got the name of non-directive psychotherapy, because Freud was not directing patients what to do. Or, in other words, Freud was not giving his patients guidance or direction or saying, well, no, I think you're doing this wrong. Maybe you might want to try that. A lot of later psychotherapists strongly differed with Freud on his issue of non-directive psychoanalysis. And they developed various forms of directive psychotherapy. Does psychoanalysis still exist? Yeah, kind of. It certainly is not as big as it was. It kind of came to a culmination at the end of the 1970s when the DSM-3, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, version 3, was published. That book used a more behavioristic view of personality disorders, psychoses, neuroses, whatever, psychiatric problems. So the DSM-3, unlike the original DSM and the DSM-2, both of which were very Freudian, the DSM-3 dumped most of that. And so you read the DSM-1 and the DSM-2, and they seem virtually identical. Why? Because they are virtually identical. In fact, if you go back to an earlier psychiatric manual that was published back in the 1920s, I have a copy of that in a PDF. If you want a copy of it, actually, just leave a note, put your email address in it if you are willing to do that, and I will send you a copy of that book since it is out of copyright. I can't do that with the other books, but since that book is out of copyright, I can send it to you. So if you really want it, you can get it from me. You can also find it online. Look around enough, but I will give it to you. It'll be my gift to you. That early diagnostic manual was also very, very Freudian. So when psychiatry began, and what many people don't know is that the original name of psychiatry was medical psychology. Medical psychology. That's what psychiatry was first called. When psychiatry began, Freud was the preeminent figure. And as I said, you can learn a lot more about Freud himself than about Freud's ideas by reading Freud's books. One reason. As I said, Freud was very territorial. If any one of his, I was going to say disciples, I'm not sure what other word I can use, students, people in his inner circle, he did have an inner circle. A lot of people were in it. If you even challenged a single idea that Freud put forward, you were kicked out, literally. And for many people, that was simply the end of their careers, because their careers began with Freud. One of the major exceptions to that was Carl Jung. Carl Jung was also a part of Freud's inner circle. But lucky for Jung, Jung already had an established practice and an established school of thought, which he called analytical psychology. So when Jung was kicked out for disagreeing with Freud on whole bunch of things. It was not a major problem for Jung. Jung was able to get himself back and find his place and get his footing without much difficulty. But for a lot of others, it was very problematic. So what the Frankfurt School did is they tried to combine this new Hegelian version of Marxism with psychoanalysis or Freudianism. Now, do I think that was a good idea? No, because I don't like Freudianism. I don't like psychoanalysis. It is a very problematic field, in my view. Reading the works of Freud, reading even the ideas of Freud, the Oedipus complex, the Electra complex. Sounds really nice, isn't it? The ego, the id, and the superego, those last three words were actually coined by the translator, because the translator did not think that the original German words could be adequately rendered in English. So those terms, ego, superego, and id, were chosen. The ego, referring to the rational self, the superego, referring to something like the conscience or the moral compass of an individual, and the id, referring to a person's lower, or I guess animalistic, nature. So to Freud, we lived our lives in this ego state, this rational state, surrounded on one side by the id and on the other side by the superego. And it was up to the individual to make a decision as to which one of those to follow. And what Freud said is that because of all of the choices, the decisions, the treatment of a kid's parents when he was growing up, that kids had tons and tons of what Freud called complexes. These were contradictions, things that really made no sense, that were stored in the unconscious mind. To Freud, we had no way of directly accessing the unconscious mind. But through hypnosis and initially dream interpretation, which Freud later gave up. But actually, I think I have that backwards. It was dream interpretation that he kept and hypnosis that he gave up. So I had that backwards. But needless to say, he saw those two practices, the interpretation of dreams and hypnosis, as ways to access, ways that the conscious mind, the awareness of an individual, could access the unconscious indirectly through symbols. And that's where the notion of the interpretation of dreams became so important, because to Freud, dreams could best be interpreted by looking at, you guessed it, by looking at the libido and violence. To Freud, those were the two major things, the two major characteristics of an individual which surfaced in the human dream. So that's kind of a negative view of human nature, at least in my opinion, which is one of the reasons I really dislike Freudianism or psychoanalysis. It's simply not my thing, as we used to say in the late 60s. But nonetheless, Freud had a very large following, lasted for a long time. Eventually, Freud's time was over and then you had a turn to behaviorism, cognitive behaviorism, then eventually humanistic psychology, then eventually transpersonal psychology. You can look those up for yourself if you're interested. They're interesting in a way, finding out what some of the succeeding schools to psychoanalysis were. Freud would not have liked any of them because Freud was psychoanalysis in a sense. Freud and psychoanalysis were virtually the same thing to Freud. So Freud was very committed to that. And again, Wilhelm Reich, and I'm pronouncing his name in the German way. Most Americans say Wilhelm Reich, but he was German, so I'm pronouncing it in the German way. Really took it to an extreme. I'll tell you what happened to Wilhelm Reich. It's an interesting story, even if it's a sideline. Then we'll get back to the Frankfurt School. What Wilhelm Reich claimed to have discovered is something that he called the orgone accumulator, meaning a device that could accumulate orgone energy, which to Freud was like the energy of the universe, maybe something like prana in Hinduism or ki in Taoism. I don't know, but he saw basically that in his view, it was possible to create a mechanism for storing orgone energy. Now, these mechanisms were not small. Why? Well, without getting too specific, he would have people get into the orgone accumulators and engage in sensual activity. Let's put it that way. And Freud and Reich's view was that simply by these people having sensual activity in the orgone accumulator was absorbing their orgone. It's kind of insane. It strikes me as kind of insane anyway. So then he found people who had various types of sexual dysfunctions, like erectile dysfunction or impotence, whatever. And he would have them go into the orgone accumulator. And according to Reich, they would supposedly absorb, I have no idea how, but somehow they would absorb that orgone energy from the orgone accumulator and then would have, I guess, good sex lives. Kind of weird, really kind of weird. Now, Reich's fate was not good. Reich lived in the US at that time. He was threatened by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to stop manufacturing these devices and promising people that he would cure their dysfunctions. Obviously, Wilhelm Reich had no training in that area. He was not qualified to give sexual guidance to people, but he did. And so even though the FDA said, stop, Wilhelm, Wilhelm did not stop. He kept on using his orgone accumulators. And so eventually he was arrested by the FDA, and sadly, he died in prison. Now, there's an entire culture or subculture of conspiratorial thinking centered around Wilhelm Reich. And that basically says that the FDA arrested Reich because they wanted those orgone accumulators for themselves. No, no, that's silly. They wanted to stop Reich from using them, and they were successful. Now, there have been successors to Reich who have used variations of orgonomy, but without the orgone accumulators, I guess because they didn't want to end up in prison as well. Makes sense. Okay, so now, did the Frankfurt School use Wilhelm Reich? No. They did not use Wilhelm Reich, but they used Freud, and they used the ideas of some other students of Freud, like Adler. And they took these ideas and they combined them with this Hegelian Marxism in their own way. One of the more interesting books which attempted to do that was a book called The One-Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse, a really interesting book. You can find it online. Go to archive.org and you will find it right there, at least last time I checked. You can read it and find out what he said. You may not agree with it, but heck, I don't agree with most of it either, but it makes a really interesting read, especially if, like me, you like theory. Now, I'm a sociological or social theorist, not a psychiatric or psychological theorist, but nonetheless, I like all kinds of theory, even theory in physics. I don't care. If it's theory, I like it. So I would suggest reading that book. That would kind of summarize some of the things that I have been saying, because what Reich did, what Marcuse did in that book was he actually combined Freudianism with Hegelian Marxism. So it's a very good illustration. There are countless other books by Frankfurt School critical theorists that you can also read that will make similar types of claims. Now, again, it's not my thing, but it may be yours. There's that famous poem by a man whom I personally dislike because I don't like his psychological theory, named Frederick S. Perls, commonly called Fritz Perls. I have that poem on my wall. I'm not sure why I have it. Maybe to remind me of how much I dislike him. Well, the poem is okay. I don't like Perls, but the poem is all right. It says, "I do my thing, you do your thing. If by chance we happen to meet each other, it's beautiful. If not, it can't be helped." That, by the way, was the origin of the term "do your own thing." So that literally came out of Gestalt therapy, not to be confused with Gestalt psychology, which is really not very similar to Gestalt therapy. I don't know why Perls chose the name Gestalt, which is the German word for configuration, but he did, for whatever his reasons were. And, and so regardless, the term Frankfurt School has been applied to all of these individuals with diverse ideas who attempted to combine this kind of Hegelian Marxism, or at least a Marxism influenced to some extent by Hegel. In other words, it was turning Marxism from being a materialistic theory into being an idealistic theory. was Hegel was an idealist. So many people would argue, including me, that the Frankfurt School was basically, I'm not going to say heresy. Heresy sounds too religious, and it sounds like I'm indicting somebody and might, uh, put them on some kind of a Salem witch trial. That's not what I mean. But certainly, um, most Marxists who are not Frankfurt School theorists would see the Frankfurt School as being a violation of the basic principles of Marxism. So do I. That is why I am not a Frankfurt School critical theorist. I am a Maoist third worldist, which is not Frankfurt School, and a critical realist, which is also not Frankfurt School. And I combine them along with intersectional Marxism and other things. So to me, the Frankfurt School, while interesting, is not particularly useful when applied to human lives. I don't really see how it could be. Now, you might disagree with me, especially if you're a Frankfurt School theorist or a critical theorist, critical social theorist. That's fine. You can disagree with me. I give you my permission. But that's my feeling. I don't like the Frankfurt School that much. Nothing against the people who started it. Some of them were really, really smart folks. But trying to combine the ideas of Freud, of all people, with this newfangled Hegelian Marxism, to me seems like a betrayal of what Marx and Engels were talking about. Again, that's just my own view for the time being. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.